Dumb Husky and his white cat Shizun. Chapter 283. Shisheng Peak, the bonfire finally ignited. The atmosphere in the loyalty hall was tense to the extreme. One point was enough to ignite the fire. The disciples at the Shisheng Peak and the disciples of the upper cultivation world stood facing each other, neither giving in to the other. The bowstring was already drawn. If it were to be pulled down again, it would either break or shoot. At this time, someone from the crowd suddenly stood up. It was the palace master of Taxia Palace, Mingguolo. Mingguolo's gentle voice broke the dangerous silence. Please wait a moment. The rules are dead and people are alive. Everyone, please consult your hearts and minds. Now that I thought about it, there was no proof to prove that the Shisheng Peak cultivated the Zhenlong chess pieces. Forcing the sect to scatter was indeed a bit too much. How about this? We temporarily put away the remnant scroll of the forbidden technique at the Shisheng Peak and carefully deliberate matters before making a decision. Master Xianjing shook his head. Palace Master Ming and sect leader Shui have a deep personal relationship. You are biased. The Shisheng Peak has already broken the taboo in the cultivation world, so why should there be a need for deliberation? Elder, you're wrong. This rule has been broken by many sections. Mingguolo spoke in a gentle tone, but his attitude was firm. He said gently, if you insist on this, then I would have to remind you that your sect was also incriminated in this affair. You dash. Suanjing's face darkened. He then brushed his sleeves, tidying up his expression once again, and said with his hands clasped together, how can the art of saving be compared to a Zhenlong chess game? Then isn't the art of rebirth counted as one of the three forbidden techniques? The one who spoke was Shui Zhengyang. By now, the people closest to him had noticed that something was wrong with Shui Zhengyang. The normally domineering and awe-inspiring man was slightly restless, the color of his lips bluish-white. Xianjing said. Naturally. Shui Zhengyang closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he stared at Xianjing again and said hoarsely, since that's the case, how can the great master exclude himself from the rules because the rebirth technique can save people? Xianjing hesitated for a while, not knowing how to explain. He stiffly said, this is not the same thing. The disciples who were at the Shisheng Peak walked up to him in anger and questioned him, why is it not the same? There are many people in the upper cultivation world who have cultivated forbidden techniques, but they have just not succeeded. If you want to severely punish our sect because of this rule, wouldn't it be better to punish you all up as well? Elder Tanlang said sinisterly, the Wuobei temple bears misdemeanor and Gai Yuye has Hua Binan. Why would you use Shisheng Peak to set an example? If sect leader Zhang wants to shut down Shisheng Peak, why not show good faith and start with yourself and announce the dissolution of Gai Yuye? No one wanted the arguments to be turned against them like this. The various sects all felt a little guilty, and the people who were clamoring just now all quieted down, not wanting to draw trouble towards their own doorsteps. He quietly covered up the blood that had been coughed out from his palm. He raised his eyes and said with a strong smile, since all the sects have done the same thing and the allegations that Shisheng Peak refined Zhenlong chess piece is not true. If it was, I won't be able to sit still. Then. Please forgive me for my rudeness everyone, please leave immediately. This. They had originally thought that they would be able to disperse this marginalized sect, but they didn't expect that they would end up in such an awkward situation. Everyone's facial expression turned ugly for a moment. Zhang Shi had no intention of forcing everyone to scatter after Shisheng Peak. However, he couldn't back down. Seeing that everyone was silent, he closed his eyes and said, let's go. Hearing this, a stone in Shui Zhenjiang's heart finally fell to the ground. He took a light breath and relaxed his tensed back. However, there was a sudden pain in his ribs. His eyes swept down and saw that the dark blue robe had mottled blood seeping out from the side of his waist. The injury from yesterday was truly too severe. He must let Elder Tanlang take a look at it in a while. Before he could finish, a disciple from the Tianyan pavilion barged into the hall, sword in hand. All of them had ice-cold expressions and were approaching menacingly. As soon as they entered the room, they said in a loud and clear voice, "Xue Zhenyang, you sure have some face. How could you say that you have never secretly refined a Zhenlong chess piece in Shisheng Peak?" None of them expected that someone from the Tianyan pavilion would come, and they all turned around in shock. However, they saw dozens of submissive people in rough clothing following behind them. There were even a few faces that looked very familiar. It seemed to be the village chief of a few small villages in Shu. "What's going on?" The first senior disciple from the Tianyan pavilion said sternly, "Don't you want evidence? Is this enough?" Another disciple said to the group, "The Shisheng Peak is filled with filth, and the sect leader is full of wild ambition. He has been spreading fishing nets throughout the years, forcing ordinary people to sacrifice young boys and girls to train in the Zhenlong chess game. These are all witnesses." Xue Zhenyang suddenly stood up, his eyes burning with fury. Blood gushed up his throat. "Nonsense. Whether or not they are spouting nonsense doesn't count even if you and I say it. You can ask them for yourself." The dozens of villagers were like a flock of frightened ducks, swaggering and sticking together. Their heads were lowered and submissive. No one dared to speak first. With his sharp eyes, Xue Meng instantly recognized a familiar face inside. He said in surprise, "Village Chief Lu." That village chief Lu suddenly shivered as his peripheral vision swept over him. Like a fish that have no hand, he swam away. "What are you doing here?" Xue Meng was unable to react for a while. He seemed somewhat innocent and cute, even though this sort of innocence seemed so pitiful at this moment. Village Chief Lu swallowed a mouthful of saliva as he pinched the corner of his robe with his skinny fingers. He kept staring at the ground, his legs swaying. The man from the Tianyan pavilion said in a domineering tone, "Do be honest, if you're lying, the Tianyan pavilion will always be impartial and will never forgive you." Village Chief Lu shivered and kneeled down fiercely, using his head to snatch the ground. I will say it. All these years, the Shisheng Peak used the cover of exterminating evil and defending the innocents, saying that they won't take a single cent. Fact was, they have been coercing us to give them the boys and girls from the village. Xue Zhenyang flew into a rage and slapped the table as he stood up. "Bullshit." The voice of the Tianyan pavilion's disciple was even louder than Xue Zhenjiang's. "Continue. Why do they want with boys and girls?" I don't know either." The village chief's forehead was covered in greasy sweat. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva and his shoulders shivered. "They said they were brought to train in the mountains, but I never saw them again. Xiao Zi, Xiao Shidu. None of them came back." The people from the Tianyan pavilion turned to ask the cultivators at the Shisheng Peak, "Among you all, do you have the children mentioned by this village chief?" "Of course not." Xue Meng's blood all over his body was boiling. "Xiao Zi, Xiao Shidu." When he rushed over to save the small village, they were already buried in the belly of the demon. Lies. Xue Meng's chest was burning with anger and his throat was filled with the sweet taste of blood. He was so angry that he was on the verge of vomiting blood. "Your kindness will repay a debt of enmity, can your conscience rest?" Village Chief Liu's expression was dejected as tears streamed down his face. However, he did not know what the Tianyan pavilion was using to force him, so he still insisted, "The Shisheng Peak is not a good section. They played it right in front. Behind. In Shu, he did. He has done countless heinous things." His tears and snot flowed, but he did not dare to look at anyone anymore. Instead, his forehead touched the ground and wailed, "The Shisheng Peak wants to dominate the cultivation world." The crowd went into an uproar. Normally, cultivators would not easily believe the words of these tens of normal villagers. However, most of the people had been sent here to avenge their deaths at home. They had already made their own decisions, and now that they had received such evidence, they could only accept it. They were furious. I knew they wouldn't do it for nothing. Xue Zhengyang, what other arguments do you have? Whether it was Xue Zhengyang, Xue Meng, or the disciples and elders at the Shisheng Peak, everyone was stunned. Before this, it was the many sects that joined hands, angrily shouting out grievances and injustice. However, at this moment, they were actually the village heads and dozens of civilians in Shu. They were people who had once offered eggs, flour, and with tears in their eyes in gratitude to the disciples of the Shisheng Peak, saying that they would never be able to repay their debt. These dozens of wolves in the mountains. They plunged the knife into the heart with their own hands. It was painful and cold. Like falling into a cave of ice, the entire body turned cold. Those witnesses came forward one by one. One of them still had guilt in their eyes, while the second one was still trembling. The third one was already able to look straight at everyone, while the fourth one began to speak righteously. He was like a goose, with his head in the front and a flock of others following him. As the saying goes, repeated rumors become the truth. As they spoke, they became impassioned. As they continued, they actually thought that they were speaking the truth. Xue Meng felt his blood run cold as he clenched his teeth. He had thought that a man had a spine that could not be broken, but he had never expected that dogs could live and drink feces. Yes, it's true. It was Chia Village's matchmaker's turn to testify. They forced us to give them our child as the reward for exterminating the devil. The Shisheng Peak does not take money but only small children. This is a rule that we from the lower cultivation all know. Zhang Shi frowned and asked, "Why are you looking for them when you already know about it?" The matchmaker then used a peach powder handkerchief to wipe his tears. "There's nothing I can do. I'm poor, and I can't afford to hire other cultivators, so I can only send a child from the village." They said that they would be sent to the Shisheng Peak to cultivate, but everyone knew what they were doing. If these pitiful children were to be given away, they won't be able to survive. As he spoke, he pounded his chest and stamped his feet, covering his face as he wailed. There was also a scholar who came to testify. Indeed, the Shisheng Peak doesn't accept money but children. We still have to live our lives, so we dare not say anything. Fortunately, the heavens have eyes, so many wrongdoings will end on their own. The Shisheng Peak has finally revealed the tail of a fox. Ladies and gentlemen, please make the decision for the lower cultivation world. Someone immediately stood out from the Jiangdong Hall and said, "Don't worry, the upper cultivation world is currently in a state of glory. Everyone here today is a reputable and upright clan. All of them have 100 years of history, so they will definitely act impartially." The townspeople who had come to testify began to weep with gratitude as they approached the Shisheng Peak and complained of the evil deeds they had done. They knew that since they had perjured themselves, there was no turning back. If the Shisheng Peak did not fall today, they would definitely settle the account with them in the future. For a moment, no one could be seen inside the hall. The only thing that could be seen were the evil spirits who were keeping watch as they opened their bloody mouths to bite down on the dilapidated wooden pillars and the simple and unadorned roof tiles and walls. Biting on the worn plaque that had been hanging on the door of the loyalty hall due to lack of funds. Fresh blood. Xue Meng was trembling. He closed his eyes and tears rolled down his face. "How can you say that? What did the Tianyan Pavilion promise them to do this? They were being forced." How could he say it out loud? How could he say it out loud? The matchmaker's crimson lips were still opening and closing, as bits and pieces of his words spread into Xue Meng's ears like poisonous snakes. The Shisheng Peak takes children and refined chess pieces, to treat human life as grass, to abduct and capture children. Each word was twisted into a ferocious nightmare. They want to dominate the cultivation world. Wearing the clothes of a beast, behaving gracefully. That Chu Wanning and Mo Ran were the ones who disliked them the most. They cheated so many innocent people just to make chess pieces. They were both filled with hatred, and their hands were trembling. His rationality crumbled. How can you say it? How can you do this? Anger, like an ant's nest, destroys the last dam in the heart. With a kaka sound, Xuemeng caught his blade's handle and drew his blade. Longcheng Tiger's roar resounded. Before anyone could react, the scimitar had already been dyed with blood. The matchmaker who was in the midst of choreographing top disciple of Shi Shengpeak assaulted a young girl was stunned. He looked down at his chest and spat out a mouthful of blood. Before he could even say a word, he fell to the ground with a thud. Dead silence. Strangely, the people from the Tianyan pavilion simply stood still beside the villagers, but did not intervene to stop them because they were shocked. Or did they just not react at all? The answer was unknown, and no one would ponder over it. Everyone's eyes were focused on Xuemeng. The blood droplets dripped down along the edge of Longchen's blade. 1 drop, 2 drops. It accumulated into a deep red pool. Feng Yu couldn't escape when the abyss fell. Ah! Suddenly, someone screamed out like an apocalyptic bell, "Kill, kill!" Xuemeng recklessly kills witnesses. Xuemeng has gone mad. The hall became even more chaotic in an instant. It was unknown who moved first as the long-suppressed flames of anger gushed and broke. The bowstring broke and the people from the Shi Shengpeak and disciples from the upper world of cultivation began to fight. Private enmity, fear, rejection. This battle contained too much selfishness that the scene instantly became out of control. Amidst the shadows of swords and the gleam of blades, Xue Zhenyang endured the pain of his wound and growled, "Stop fighting, all of you stop." However, when the people at the Shi Shengpeak listened to him, other cultivators did not stop. Xuemeng's heart was already crushed, so much so that his eyes turned moist red. While holding the scimitar and hacking away at evil spirits, he could not stop sobbing and crying. Perhaps it was only at this moment that Meng Er truly understood the feeling that Mo Ran had felt when he was young. In Jade Wine House, when a machete was slaughtering an entire building's worth of people, the despair, the disgust, the excitement, and self-loathing he felt. Nothing mattered anymore. Anger had burned his heart and only blood could extinguish it. Suddenly, a sword blocked his attack. The sword emitted a brilliant blue light, and it looked extremely familiar, but Xuemeng couldn't recall it at this moment. He only roared at the ugly appearance of the Taxu Palace mistress, "Get lost! Don't stop me! Stop fighting! If you continue, you will really cause trouble. Calm down." A familiar voice entered his ears. Who is it? Xuemeng could not remember, nor was he willing to think about it. Pain and hatred broke his heart. A man's patience had its limits. Beyond that hurdle, a deity would become a vengeful ghost and a saint turned into an Asura. One remembrance of the Buddha, one remembrance of the devil. His eyes were red and filled with hatred. The hatred that had been burning inside him ever since he entered the Tianyan pavilion had finally exploded outward, swallowing him in an instant. Get lost! Longcheng and that blue sword clashed, but that crude-looking man was not inferior in the slightest. He struggled against the sword as a pair of jade-green eyes stared at Xuemeng's face. If you still don't calm down, you will only cause your death to be even more miserable. Who do you think you are? Is it your turn to meddle? The more he thrusted his sword, the more vicious he became. However, the other sword remained calm as it clashed with the other. Green eyes stared at the black, familiar eyes. Who was it? Zimming, stop fighting. A slow voice rang in his ears. It wasn't much, but there was still a trace of anxiety and pity in it. Xuemeng's frenzied and chaotic mind seemed to flash with a trace of brilliance. His fierce and fiendish attack slightly halted, but his chest was still fiercely rising and falling. At this moment, his face was covered in blood, and his hair was in a mess. He glared fiercely at the ugly man. "You!" Before he could say anything, he felt a cold wind blow behind his back. Xuemeng suddenly turned his head. It was already too late to lift Longcheng up. His arm had been cut open, leaving behind a hideous bloody wound that went straight to his bones. Meng Er. Xue Zhenyang saw that his beloved son was injured and rushed over to save him. The Tianyan Pavilion's 10 or so elites, who were all Mu Yanli's death soldiers, looked at each other as they pounced at Xue Meng. These people's individual strength were all similar to the elders at the Shisheng Peak. They had all launched their death blow towards Xue Meng, who was already injured and was about to take young Phoenix's life. Meng Er. Meng Er. However, the distance between them was too far. Xue Zhenyang was unable to come over, but more people had already encircled him, trapping him within. Xue Zhenyang was anxious to protect his son. His body was also wounded under the powerful attacks and his blood was all over the place. Xue Meng gritted his teeth and brandished his blade. He had pushed away 2 people in one strike, but his arm was bleeding profusely and his entire wrist was trembling. Suddenly, a red light flashed. "Be careful!" In the time it took for a spark to fly off of a piece of flint, the green-eyed man that had fought with him earlier had blocked a killing move for him. The Tianyan Pavilion disciple squinted his eyes. "A traitor has appeared in the Taxia Palace. You want to stand together with the Shisheng Peak?" The azure-eyed man did not answer, but kept his sword as cold as frost. He turned around and said to Xue Meng with a pale face and fierce eyes, "Go to uncle. Hurry up." Xue Meng covered the blade of his arm. In reality, he could not even hold on. The bones beneath his flesh were exposed to the air, and his entire arm was drenched in hot blood. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but he did not. His gaze fell on Xue Zhenyang. With just this glance, the last traces of blood on Xue Meng's face faded. He almost cried out miserably as he ran towards Xue Zhenyang, ignoring the danger. He roared, "Father!" Xue Zhenjiang's eyes turned cold. He immediately reacted and raised his hand to block the man behind him with his fine steel wrist guard. He then threw the man to the ground. Xue Meng abruptly let out a breath of relief and squeezed to his father's side as if he didn't care about his life. He grabbed Xue Zhenjiang's arm fiercely, feeling sad and happy at the same time. "It's all right, father, I'm fine. I'm fine." Xue Zhenyang, on the other hand, had been injured from the previous attack and a large amount of blood gushed out from his waist, but his body was already covered in red, so Xue Meng did not notice it. He grabbed his father's hand and said, "Father, I want revenge. Today I want the lives of these people, and the lives of others. Cough cough." The voice suddenly stopped. Xue Meng saw Xue Zhenyang abruptly kneeling on the ground, blood gushing out of his throat. "Father!" Meng Er was instantly stupefied. He had never seen his father suffer such heavy injuries in his entire life. In that instant, his mind buzzed and he said, "Father, what's wrong?" "You." Xue Zhenjiang's blood-stained lips opened and closed. He held Xue Meng's arm and said hoarsely, "Stop." "What?" Xue Zhenyang stared at Xue Meng's face, but his peripheral vision also scanned the surroundings for signs of trouble. Was this battle what he wanted? There were shouts everywhere. Red blood and white brain matter splattered. Even before the mastermind was found, the various sects and sects had already started to kill each other. Xue Zhenyang said, "Tell those at the Shisheng Peak to stop." "But they. What can we do if we continue fighting?" Xue Zhenjiang's face was ashen. "Who can get what they want? Or is it because the sect is destroyed?" Xue Meng did not say anything. His eyes were red, and even the tips of his fingers were trembling. "Go." Xue Zhenyang gave him a light push, and Xue Meng's tears fell. He almost staggered to his feet, stood in front of his father, and yelled, "Still your weapons. Stop fighting." End chapter. Dumb Husky and his white cat Shizun. Chapter 284. Shisheng Peak. My son is extremely precious. As if all his strength and arrogance had been drained from his voice, Meng abruptly closed his eyes, his cheeks hot and wet. Stop. However, it was just like a prairie fire. It was easy to burn but very difficult to extinguish. After a messy battle, the hall was already filled with dead and injured people. The blood of these people had turned into hot oil, igniting the hatred and madness within them. For a moment, Meng's roar also sounded good. Zhenjiang's sigh didn't get much of an attention. Even if they did, the pairs of bloodshot eyes would not stop. There was too much unease these days. One after another murder cases, Heavenly Rift, Zhenlong Chess Formation, Massacre at Gaiyuye. The Jiangdong Hall was in a mess. The beaten manor had been masterless for many days and there was no mourning temple or Buddhist temple that wasn't stained with blood. Many cultivators present had lost their friends and relatives in the past few days. Who was the mastermind? Who was lying? There was no answer, but all the directions pointed to the Shisheng Peak, and thus the accumulated hatred and fear exploded in this one battle. It was difficult to stop it. Meng had not experienced many great battles, so he still did not understand what this meant. His chest rose up and down as he stood in place, watching the crazy slaughter. However, Zhenyang already knew that things had gone out of control at this point, so much so that even the culprit wouldn't have expected it. He gritted his teeth as he endured the pain of his wound cracking and the dizziness he had in front of him as he grabbed Meng's shoulder. Hurry up and leave. Father! Get out of here quickly. Go to your mother, quick. However, before his voice fell, 7 or 8 people had already gathered in front of the two of them and each of their eyes were bloodshot from killing intent. Meng, you killed my senior brother. I want you to pay with your life. Son of a beast. Meng froze in place. He killed this person's senior brother? When? He had clearly never harmed anyone, he had never. His mind was in a mess. In the confusion, he looked down and saw that the long cheng in his hands was dripping with blood. He felt a chill run down his spine. Yes, he did. He killed first the lying matchmaker, then. He couldn't remember. He had just started a mad slaughter. His hands were covered with blood, his face was covered with blood. His face and hands were covered. Meng suddenly howled like a dying beast. His forehead, tendons, and veins bulged, and his eyes were bloodshot. Why did it become like this? Everything had changed since the day Mo Ran left. One by one, everything was falling out of his control, and he was moving further and further away from his former self. I killed someone. Father! I killed someone! He turned around in panic, only to see Zhenjiang's terrifyingly pale face in front of him. Zhenyang grabbed his hand and dragged him behind him. Then he himself used the iron fan to cut and kill the attacking person in front, creating a path of blood in the heavy encirclement. Let's go. A man on the verge of collapse was giving his son, who was no longer a youth, a chance to live. Meng, hurry up and leave. Meng stood there stiffly without moving. At this time, another person rushed forward to attack. Zhenyang could no longer resist as he raised his hand to grab the hilt of that person's blade. Instantly, blood flowed like a fountain, causing his bones to be visible. Zhenyang cursed. With his other hand, he took out a dagger from his waist and stabbed it into the man's stomach. Hot blood gushed out. Go! Zhenyang roared. He suddenly caught sight of someone and shouted sternly, Hanks, you! Take him out! Take him away from here! May Hanks Yu had also been fighting in this direction. At this moment, he finally broke through the heavy encirclement and floated over to Meng's side. He first glanced at Zhenyang and his eyes actually showed a faint pain. Then, he grabbed Meng's arm and said in a deep voice, Follow me. After he finished speaking, he brought Meng, who had already become numb and dazed, with him as he charged towards the back door of the loyalty hall to fight his way out. Perhaps it was because of the Taxu Palace's betrayal that everyone was distracted for a while. Mei Hangxiu had brought Xuemeng to the entrance of the hall, and only then did someone react. With an angry roar, he pounced at the two of them and yelled, "You want to run after killing someone? Who would pay with their lives?" Mei Hangxiu swept his hand through the air, causing a series of clanging sounds, like metal breaking through the air, to repel the enemies in front of him. Just as he was feeling relieved, he suddenly heard Xue Zhenyang yell, "Watch your back." He suddenly turned his head, only to see a man with a face full of blood, slashing down with his blade, but it was already too late to block at this time. A steel fan suddenly flew up into the air, and after tempering its spirit energy, it spun in midair, and pierced straight towards the man, instantly piercing through his chest. "Uncle! Father!" The two young men turned around and saw Xue Zhenyang gasping for breath. Obviously, this attack had consumed a lot of his energy. The iron fan landed on the ground after hitting its target. Blood stained the fan. Regardless of whether it was the beautiful Xuelang or the ugly people, the words on the fan could no longer be seen clearly. Xue Zhenyang made a gesture to the two of them with great difficulty and said softly, "Quick." Before he had even said anything, Xuemeng's pupils contracted to reflect a heavy sword that was filled with spirit energy. A Jiangdong Hall disciple was standing behind Xue Zhenyang with a ferocious blade in hand. Before Xuemeng could even make a sound, he had already turned towards his father. A slash down. He lost his voice. Xuemeng's eyes widened. Suddenly, he could not hear anything around him. It was just like a calm sea that was 10,000 miles deep. There was no wind, no heat, and no light. Only pitch black. The blood flow throughout Xuemeng's entire body seemed to have frozen yet at the same time exploded. It was absolutely horrifying. His pair of eyes were cracking with fury as he stared at the person in front of him. Because he had seen his son was saved, Xue Zhenjiang's face showed traces of relief and gratification. His expression froze at this moment. He felt a sense of serenity. The sea was deep and endless. The water was very cold and could not be removed. It was very quiet, deathly still. No sound. No sound. No. Until blood dripped down from the cracked top, down his eyes and down his face. 2 lines, red like tears, dripping down. At this moment, Xuemeng seemed to think that this was a joke, or perhaps it was a dream, or perhaps all of this could still be turned around and be rectified in time. But no. Too late. If there was concern, then there would be weakness. War gods will also die. Father! With a roar, the mountain range entered the sea. All the silence was shattered by this waves rolling up, 1,000 piles of snow, but the stones breaking the sky, the torrents pouring down, the seas churning, the waves splitting the sky. Xuemeng ran towards Xue Zhenyang like a madman. He shouted like a dying beast, tearing through the sky to cut off all the underlings' movements. Upon hearing his shout, everyone turned around in fright. The waves parted, and he stumbled through the crowd towards Xue Zhenyang. Xue Zhenyang stood there without even bending his spine. He just stared at Xuemeng like that, his tiger-like eyes wide open. Those eyes made Xuemeng feel like he was still alive, that he could still be saved, and Xue Zhenyang fell when he was just inches away. With a plop, he almost fell straight down. The 4 of them were scattered and there were no longer any sounds of fighting. Xuemeng suddenly stopped. He did not continue forward. He just stood there, trembling all over. From a tiny tremble to a violent shaking, lips, fingers, there was not a single part of him that was not under his control. He murmured, inquiringly, carefully. He said hoarsely, "Father." The entire hall was filled with blood. No one answered. With a clang sound, the Longchenj saber fell to the ground. Xuemeng slowly retreated. But where could he retreat to? Yesterday. I'll never go back to yesterday. Any step in life, whether it is a mistake, whether it is painful, as long as it was taken, there is no turning back. The loyalty hall was deathly silent. He stopped retreating, his body swaying violently. He then kneeled on the ground, staring blankly at the scene before him. Tears could not stop flowing down his face. He raised his hand and tried to wipe it away, but he couldn't wipe it away no matter how hard he tried. At last he buried his face in his palm, and a little whimper came from his throat, like ink on paper, and then the paper was ridiculous and stained with ink. "Father! Father!" The whimper eventually turned into a wail. The people supporting Xuemeng's path were unable to stand up again. With their broad shoulders and hearty smiles, they helped him block out the storms of life. The days of the blessed youth truly ended at this moment. The earth crumbled. It was a mess. Everything was a mess. The ruthless Jiangdongtang cultivator froze in place, his heavy sword dropped onto the ground as he muttered, "No, no. It's not me." He could not help but shake his head. Seeing Xuemeng kneel where he stood, seemingly in a state of madness, he was extremely afraid, trembling like a sieve. He wanted to flee for his life, but everyone's eyes were focused on him. He had nowhere to run to. "No. Listen to me. I only wanted to take down the weapon in his hand." He stared at Xuemeng, nervously swallowing his saliva. At this moment, Xuemeng was still immersed in great grief. However, he knew that once Xuemeng raised his eyes, there was only one path for him: death. "Hurry and call Madame Wang over." Elder Suanji was the calmest of everyone. As he looked at Xuemeng, who was curled up on the ground, he still hadn't stood up and was still crying. He instructed his disciple in a low voice, "Be quick, I'm afraid that no one will be able to stop the young master later." Seeing the sect leader's death, the disciple's face was filled with tears. "But master," the sect leader forbade the madam from coming. The madam would never interfere in major matters. "She. Why are you still talking about this at this time?" Elder Suanji said, "Quickly go." The disciple wiped his tears away and ran back to the mountain with a nod. Only after the sect leader died did everything finally start to calm down. There were people in the hall who were in pain from their wounds, some who were livid, some who were pursing their lips without saying a word. Another person whispered, "What's going on?" Xue Zhenjiang's ability shouldn't be limited to just that. How could he not be able to dodge it? What they didn't know was that Xue Zhenyang had been stabbed in the vital parts because he had fought and killed a malevolent spirit in Vuchame town the day before. He had been injured in the vital parts of his body. They only sighed, "Ai, the longer you stay, the older you become. It's too late to be a hero." Xuemeng did not listen to those rustling words. His eyes gradually became covered with blood due to tears and hatred. He sobbed, and wailed. In the end, his eyes became a sea of red maple. He lifted his eyes and stared at the invaders. His eyes used to burn with pure clarity and sincerity, but now only blood and hatred remained, as well as enmity. An angry howl. Long Cheng burst into action. "Kill!" This time, Xuemeng really lost control of his mind. He screamed at the top of his lungs. He had become so terrifying that he lost all sense of reason. He was not afraid of death, nor was he afraid of pain. Who could stop him? No one could stop him. Liubei Temple, Gai Yuye, Jiangdong Hall, Huohuang Pavilion. Pui. He didn't care. He could only see the faces of the wraiths, as well as their distorted figures. He felt as if he was in purgatory, in the midst of an endless sea of blood. Hate. Why? Why was it that 20 years of hard work was not enough to escape a single misjudgment, a few gossips? Why did he spend all his life bowing to someone, in the end, only paying something in the wrong with sincerity? Why was he trying to nurture kindness and enmity? It's so stupid. Blood flowed like a river. No one could hear his words and no one was able to persuade him otherwise. Xuemeng was going crazy. The phoenix desired blood and his blood boiled into a fire. From the fire came a pair of scarlet red eyes of a vicious beast. Its bloody teeth bit through the throats of everyone who tried to stop him. That year when the cicadas were chirping in the middle of summer, Xue Zhenyang smiled as he patted Xuemeng's head and asked, "What does my son want to do in the future?" "Just like daddy." Meng Er's eyes were clear as he said, "Be a great hero. Be a good man and punish evil. Worthy of living up to your words." Blood sprayed on his face, and someone screamed miserably. "Who did he kill?" "Seems to be someone's sister and wife." "It doesn't matter. It was fine if she died. In any case, he wasn't a clean person anymore. In any case, they had brought this upon themselves. They forced him. He massacred like a madman, and the crowd dispersed. He couldn't hear it. Can't hear. Until that person's voice rang out. Meng Er. It was as if he was pinched where it hurt the most. A trembling voice that was trying hard to suppress its emotions. A soft and delicate fragrance rose up in the air, and the tip of his finger pinched the smoke before dispersing it. Xuemeng was stunned. "Seize him. Don't let him go crazy again." People rushed in from all directions. Meng Er. Xuemeng was a beast that was being attacked by a pack of wolves. His entire body was covered in blood and his arm was trembling uncontrollably. After this battle, he would probably never be able to use this arm to hold the saber again. He narrowed his eyes. Blood dripped from his eyes. He turned his head stiffly. The back door of the loyalty hall was wide open and boundless daylight spilled in. Madame Wang appeared in the doorway, dressed in plain white. Her body was weak, his temperament gentle, and she never interfered in any affairs in front of this hall. She had always been like this. It was only at this moment that she heard the news and arrived. She was a beautiful lady with long hair and a flowing dress. Xuemeng asked hoarsely, his voice broken. "Mother." All of the disciples at the summit of the mountain bowed down. "Madam." The elders bowed as well. "Madame Wang." There was not a single trace of blood on her face, the only trace of beauty was the coral red pearl on her earrings. She did not utter a single word. She first saw her husband's corpse and her body fiercely swayed. Then she saw Xuemeng being suppressed by someone and falling to his knees. Her face became even paler. The disciples were worried about her weak body. They were afraid that she would pass out the very next moment. But Madame Wang only trembled slightly, her lips moving slightly. For the first time, she was unable to speak. But the second time, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, but she tried her best to remain calm. "Let him go." These three words were softly said to those people who were violently suppressing Xuemeng. Many of those people had never even seen Madame Wang's face before. Now that they saw her, they felt that she was just an extremely weak woman, so they fiercely said to her, "Your son has killed so many people. How can we release him? We must bring him to the Tianyan pavilion to be detained for trial." There were tears in Madame Wang's eyes, but she continued to speak word by word, "Let him go." No one let go. Everyone was in a deadlock. Madame Wang slightly raised her head, as if she was trying to hold back her tears, but to no avail. Bitter, salty tears rolled down her cheeks. She closed her eyes. Her slender body was trembling slightly, as weak as the wind. Someone said, "The Shisheng Peak has to be dissolved today, and countless cultivators of the upper cultivation world have been injured." Mo Ran and Chu Wanning were suspicious, so no matter what, they had to seek justice murder to pay for it. "Madam, I'm sorry." Madame Wang did not say anything, nor did she look at her husband's corpse again. She silently walked through the crowd that she had consciously dispersed. Step by step, she reached the highest level of the pedestal and stood in front of the position of sect leader. Everyone stood still. Everyone below was buzzing loudly. Sect leader Xue's death was purely due to coincidence, but Xuemen deliberately killed. That's right, we must take him away. The sound was like a tide, rising and falling in waves, one after the other. The wind blew into the hall, the curtains fluttered. Xuemen is innocent. Bam! A loud sound rang out. The entire hall was shocked. The one who slammed the table was actually this weak and frail woman. Madame Wang's eyes were wide open and her beautiful face, like a lotus, was flushed red. She didn't know how to get angry, but the anger had already burned her heart. She stood in front of the hall, her gaze sweeping past everyone. Meng Er is my child, Ran Er is my nephew, and Zhenyang is my husband. Her voice was quiet, but her words were clear and decisive. You all, dig out my nephew's spiritual core and take away his life. Now, you also want to take my son away in front of me. There were many women in Jiangdong Hall, but they couldn't understand what Madame Wang was feeling. Immediately, a female cultivator coldly said, Madame Wang, please speak some reason. That's right. If your nephew wasn't cultivating this forbidden technique, why would we dig out his spiritual core? If your husband hadn't listened to his advice, how could it have ended up in such a mess? If your son didn't kill countless people, why would we take him away? Madame Wang, you have to own up to your own mistakes. At this time, the hatred between the various sects and the Shisheng Peak had suddenly deepened, and none of them were willing to let them off easily. Close the door. Take away all the people who just attacked. We had to severely punish them. Do you really want to let go of all these murderous demons? We can't let any of them go, capture them all. Madame Wang stood at the top of the hall, facing the scene of chaos. The frail woman closed her eyes, then slowly opened her mouth. The deceased of Shi Shengpeak will stay here. If they were still alive, I wouldn't allow any of you to touch a single hair on them, or touch a hair on my son's head. The rest of the crowd found this funny, except for Zhang Shi, whose expression changed slightly. Beside the pillar, a female cultivator from Jiangdong Hall was the first to speak. You really boast too shamelessly. Madame Wang slowly walked down the steps of the hall. She ignored the female cultivator and said to everyone who was looking at her, what ability do you have to bully orphans and widows? After walking down the last step, she stopped on the dark red carpet embroidered with pollia flower and raised her pair of beautiful eyes. Her face was still gentle, but her eyes were firm. She raised her hand, moved it, and removed a silver bracelet from her wrist. The female cultivator who had mocked her narrowed her eyes and asked, what are you doing? Madame Wang raised her hand. For some reason, a dazzling red light suddenly appeared in her palm. With a flick of her fingers, the silver bracelet was crushed into fine powder. Many people were so frightened that they took a step back. Even the people from Shi Sheng Peak were so shocked that they couldn't speak. Xuemen was also stunned. Among the crowd, there was only Zhang Shi who wasn't surprised. He stared at her. His face was extremely ugly, but he wasn't surprised at all. The Shi Sheng Peak will remain. Everyone, if anyone were to close our doors and step forward. Madame Wang brushed away the powder from the silver bracelet and raised her eyes to say something that would cause everyone's faces to change in fear. You'll have to fight me. End chapter.